Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. It was a particular Tuesday in the autumn of 1846 when the first rumors about the Preston twins began to circulate through Savannah. The wealthy spinster sisters, residing in their imposing plantation home some 17 miles west of the city, had reportedly made a most unusual announcement at a gathering of the county's elite. According to those present, they had introduced two well-dressed men as their new husbands. What made this declaration send waves of shock through proper Georgian society wasn't merely that the sisters had married on the same day without prior announcement. It was what several guests later whispered about the grooms, men who, despite their fine attire that evening, had been recognized by some as formerly enslaved individuals from the Preston estate. The Preston family had long been a subject of quiet discussion in Savannah society. The twins, Elizabeth and Margaret, had inherited Willow Creek Plantation after their parents perished in a carriage accident in 1839. Unlike most women of their station, they never appointed a male relative or hired an overseer to manage their considerable property. Instead, they maintained complete control over the plantation's operations and the approximately 73 people they enslaved. The sisters were known for their peculiar habits and reclusive nature, rarely attending social functions and receiving few visitors at their estate. What particularly marked the Preston twins in the social consciousness of Savannah was their appearance. Born in 1812, the sisters had reached the age of 34 by the time of these events. They possessed strikingly similar features that many considered unfortunate: heavy-set figures, unusually prominent facial features, and a complexion marred by early signs of aging. Their physical appearance had made them objects of cruel gossip since their youth, earning them unflattering nicknames that circulated in drawing rooms across the county. This social rejection had seemingly turned the twins inward, strengthening their unusual bond while deepening their isolation from proper society. The first official record pertaining to the scandal appears in the journal of Dr. Samuel Wilson, the Preston family physician. His entry from September 28, 1846, notes being summoned to Willow Creek under mysterious circumstances. "Called to the Preston estate this evening on urgent business," he wrote, the nature of which was not disclosed in the message. "Upon arrival, I was most perplexed to find Miss Elizabeth and Miss Margaret in seemingly good health, seated in the parlor with two male Negroes dressed in gentlemen's clothing. The sisters introduced these men as Mr. James and Mr. William, referring to them with surnames I shall not commit to paper. More disturbing still, they addressed these men as husband. When I expressed my shock, Miss Elizabeth calmly requested I record 2 marriages in the family Bible, claiming the ceremonies had been conducted privately the previous Sunday. I departed without fulfilling this inappropriate request, and am greatly troubled by what appears to be a dangerous mental disturbance affecting both sisters simultaneously." The doctor's account was soon corroborated by Reverend Thomas Blackwell of St. John's Episcopal Church, who noted in a letter to his bishop that he had declined a substantial donation from the Preston sisters after they had requested he retroactively recognize their unholy and impossible unions. The Reverend described the sisters as perfectly lucid, yet morally insensate, expressing concern that their mental faculties appeared intact while their moral compass had suffered some grave distortion. What followed was a period of approximately 3 months, during which the Preston twins withdrew completely from public life. Deliveries to the plantation continued as usual, but no visitors were received. According to subsequent testimony from merchants who supplied the estate, orders changed subtly during this time. The usual quantities of food increased, and requests for fine fabrics, men's toiletries and luxury items appeared on the lists. Most notably, a jeweler in Savannah reported being commissioned to create 2 matching gold rings in men's sizes, paid for with Preston family credit. The plantation's operations appeared to continue without disruption during this period. Cotton harvests were delivered on schedule, accounts were settled promptly, and no unusual activity was noted by neighboring landowners. The only peculiarity reported by those who conducted business at the property's periphery was the absence of the sisters themselves, who had previously overseen all transactions personally. Instead, written instructions were provided bearing what appeared to be Elizabeth Preston's signature. The first significant development came in January of 1847, when Charles Montgomery, the county sheriff, received a letter from Margaret Preston's distant cousin in Charleston. This letter, preserved in county records, expressed concern about the disturbing rumors surrounding his cousins and requested an official welfare check. Montgomery's subsequent report states that upon visiting Willow Creek Plantation, he was received in the main house by Elizabeth Preston alone, who appeared composed though somewhat altered in appearance. She assured the sheriff that all was well and attributed the rumors to the jealousy and idle gossip of neighbors. When Montgomery inquired about her sister and the alleged husbands, Elizabeth reportedly stated that Margaret was indisposed and that the men in question were merely trusted servants who had been given additional responsibilities in managing the estate. The sheriff, finding no evidence of illegality and seeing the plantation operating in apparent order, departed with his suspicions unresolved but with no legal cause for further inquiry. What transpired next is documented in fragments across various sources, including correspondence between local officials, church records, and the private journals of neighboring plantation owners. These accounts, when assembled, reveal a community caught between moral outrage, morbid curiosity, and uncertainty about how to address a situation that defied social norms and legal frameworks of the time. A pivotal document emerged in March of 1847, a letter from Elizabeth Preston to the family's attorney in Savannah. In this correspondence, she instructed him to revise the Preston will, dividing the estate equally between herself, her sister, and their legal husbands, whom she named with surnames matching their own. The attorney, Robert Fleming, refused to execute these instructions and instead contacted several male relatives of the Preston family, urging intervention. His letter to a Preston cousin in Atlanta described the situation as a matter of the gravest concern, indicating a complete departure from reason and propriety that threatens not only the family name but the very social order upon which our way of life depends. The subsequent events unfolded with a particular kind of Southern deliberation, not swift but inexorable. In early April, 3 male relatives arrived from Atlanta and Augusta, accompanied by Dr. Wilson and a specialist in mental disorders from the Georgia State Asylum. Their intent, as later recorded in Dr. Wilson's journal, was to evaluate the sisters' mental condition and, if necessary, remove them to the asylum for treatment. What they discovered upon arriving at Willow Creek has been described in several accounts, though with significant variations that suggest either embellishment or attempts to sanitize the more disturbing elements. The most comprehensive account comes from the journal of Dr. Edward Hayes, the asylum specialist. He wrote, "Upon our arrival at Willow Creek, we found the main house in a state that defies easy description. The parlor and dining room were appointed as one would expect of a home of such standing, yet the master bedrooms had been arranged in a manner suggesting cohabitation of the sisters with male companions. More distressingly, these men were present on the property, dressed in fine clothing, clearly purchased for gentlemen rather than appropriate attire for their station. They initially attempted to prevent our entrance to certain rooms, speaking with an authority no enslaved person should possess. When confronted by the male relatives, these two men, extraordinarily similar in appearance despite no apparent blood relation, exhibited neither fear nor appropriate deference, instead carrying themselves with the bearing of legitimate masters of the house. The account continues. The sisters, when finally located in the East Wing sitting room, presented an altered appearance from their last documented observation. Both had arranged their hair in elaborate styles more suited to younger women, wore expensive gowns, and were adorned with jewelry typically reserved for married ladies of standing. Most notably, both wore wedding bands. Their physical appearance, however, was unchanged, their unfortunate features perhaps even more pronounced by their attempts at beautification. Upon being informed of our purpose, both became agitated, but not in the manner of the merely hysterical. Instead, they exhibited a cold, calculating resistance, with Elizabeth informing us that we were unwelcome trespassers on private property, while Margaret summoned the male Negroes, referring to them as my husband and my sister's husband without any apparent shame. What followed was described as a difficult removal of the sisters from their home. The men they had claimed as husbands were immediately restrained and taken to the slave quarters. According to Dr. Hayes, this separation provoked the only genuine emotional response from the sisters, who had until then maintained a disturbing composure. Miss Elizabeth, upon seeing the man she called James being forcibly removed, emitted a sound I have never before heard from a human throat. Not quite a scream, not merely a wail, but something that suggested a profound severing. Miss Margaret collapsed entirely, requiring physical support to remain upright. The sisters were transported to Savannah that same day and temporarily housed with a distant relative while arrangements were made for their transfer to the asylum in Milledgeville. During this interim period, Elizabeth Preston managed to send a letter to the family attorney, which was later found among his papers. In it, she wrote with remarkable clarity, "You mistake our condition entirely. We suffer no delusion or confusion of mind. We have merely chosen to acknowledge openly what many plantation mistresses conceal, that the boundaries between master and slave sometimes dissolve in the privacy of night. Our sin was not in our actions, but in our honesty. James and William are as much our husbands indeed as any man is to any woman in this hypocritical society. That we chose to honor this truth rather than hide it like a shameful secret is our only transgression against Southern propriety." This letter never received a response. On April 15, 1847, Elizabeth and Margaret Preston were admitted to the Georgia State Asylum with a diagnosis of moral insanity and erotomania, conditions believed at the time to affect primarily women and to manifest as irrational attachments and improper desires that contradicted social norms while leaving intellectual faculties intact. The subsequent management of Willow Creek Plantation was assumed by Henry Preston, a cousin from Augusta, who immediately ordered an inventory of the property. Among the items catalogued were several unusual findings in the sisters' private quarters. 2 journals written in a cipher that was never decoded, a collection of daguerreotypes showing the sisters alongside the 2 men they had claimed as husbands, and various personal items belonging to these men that would have been extraordinary possessions for enslaved persons, including gold cufflinks, pocket watches, and books. The fate of the 2 men, identified as James and William, remains largely undocumented in official records. A single entry in the plantation ledger taken over by Henry Preston notes the removal of 2 problematic influences in late April, with a corresponding credit entry suggesting they had been sold to a trader specializing in markets further south, likely in New Orleans, or potentially for export to Cuba or Brazil. The Preston sisters remained at the Georgia State Asylum for approximately 3 years. Treatment records indicate they were subjected to the standard procedures of the era for female mental patients, including cold water treatments, isolation, and various sedatives. Reports from attending physicians noted their continued insistence on referring to themselves as Mrs. rather than Miss, and occasional inquiries about the welfare of the men they considered their husbands. Separate quarters were arranged after it was discovered they were exchanging coded messages when allowed to interact. Margaret Preston died in the asylum in January of 1850 from what was recorded as wasting disease, though modern analysis of the symptoms described suggests tuberculosis, which was common in institutional settings of the period. Elizabeth survived until October of that year, passing away after a reported refusal to eat that lasted several weeks. The attending physician noted in his final report that she had become increasingly withdrawn after her sister's death, speaking only to ask about James or to request writing materials, which were denied due to concerns she would attempt to contact accomplices outside the institution. The Preston family arranged for quiet burials in the family plot near Savannah, with simple markers that omitted the dates of death, a common practice when attempting to minimize the stigma of asylum confinement and mental illness. Willow Creek Plantation continued to operate under Henry Preston's management until 1861, when Union forces advancing through Georgia destroyed much of the property during Sherman's march to the sea. The land was eventually sold in parcels during Reconstruction, and the main house, partially rebuilt, changed hands several times before burning completely in 1912. Interest in the Preston case remained minimal until 1963, when historian Eleanor Hammond discovered the asylum records while researching her doctoral dissertation on women's mental health treatment in the Antebellum South. Her subsequent paper, Moral Insanity, the Case of the Preston Twins, brought academic attention to the story, though she approached it primarily as an example of how women's defiance of social norms was pathologized and medically punished. The most intriguing development came in 1967, when renovations to an old law office in Savannah uncovered a hidden compartment containing what appeared to be personal papers of Robert Fleming, the Preston family attorney. Among these was a sealed envelope addressed to future generations, in what handwriting experts later confirmed was Elizabeth Preston's script. The letter inside, dated April 12, 1847, just days before the sisters were institutionalized, provides the only known account of the events from her perspective. What none shall understand is that our crime was not one of impropriety, but of recognition, she wrote. James and William were born as property, yes, but nature gifted them with minds and hearts superior to most men of our acquaintance. They were educated in secret by our own father, who recognized their exceptional qualities but lacked the courage to acknowledge them publicly. For 7 years following our parents' deaths, they have been our true companions, partners in both the management of this estate and the privacy of our hearts. The profits of Willow Creek have doubled under their guidance, though we claimed the credit to avoid scrutiny. That society cannot recognize the dignity in these men, while celebrating the most brutal and ignorant among the planter class merely because of an accident of birth, reveals the true madness, and it resides not in our minds, but in the contradictions upon which our society is built. The letter continues for several pages, providing details about the relationships that had developed and the sisters' deliberate decision to make their arrangements public despite knowing the likely consequences. Elizabeth described it as a sacrifice we make willingly, a testament that might survive even if we do not, proof that even in this darkest of times and places, genuine affection can transcend the artificial boundaries erected by men. Most striking is her closing paragraph. I harbor no illusions about our fate or that of our beloveds. Southern society will destroy what it cannot understand, and it understands precious little beyond its own narrow codes and hypocrisies. But I write this so that someone, someday, might know that in the spring of 1846, 4 people dared to live honestly on a plantation west of Savannah, creating a small world of equality within a larger one built on its opposite. For 9 months, we experienced what might be possible in a more enlightened age. It is for this brief triumph, rather than our inevitable defeat, that I wish to be remembered. The authenticity of this letter has been debated by historians, with some suggesting it may be a later forgery created to sensationalize an already unusual case. Others point to linguistic analysis and handwriting comparison with known samples of Elizabeth Preston's correspondence as evidence of its legitimacy. The document remains in the Georgia Historical Society archives, catalogued as unverified but of significant historical interest. Perhaps the most haunting element of the Preston case is found not in any official record, but in an oral history collected from a woman named Sarah Johnson, interviewed in 1937 as part of the Federal Writers' Project documentation of formerly enslaved persons. Johnson, then approximately 102 years old, had been enslaved at a plantation neighboring Willow Creek as a young woman. When asked if she remembered anything about the Preston twins, she fell silent for several minutes before responding. "Those poor ugly ladies," she reportedly said. "Folks said they went crazy, but they wasn't crazy. They just forgot where they was living. They thought they was people first and white women second. Down here it's always the other way round. Can't put people first in a place built on making some folks not people at all." When pressed for details about the men involved, Johnson shook her head. "Handsome boys, both of them. Too handsome for their own good. People don't talk about what happened to them after. Some things too terrible to keep in mind." The interviewer noted that Johnson refused to elaborate further and changed the subject immediately afterward, suggesting that whatever knowledge she possessed about the men's ultimate fate was something she preferred not to articulate. The story of the Preston twins and their alleged husbands remains a historical footnote, documented in fragments scattered across asylum records, personal correspondence, legal documents, and oral histories. What truly occurred at Willow Creek Plantation in those 9 months of 1846 to 1847, the private realities behind the public scandal, can never be fully known. The principals left few direct testimonies, and those that exist were filtered through the perspectives and prejudices of their time. What remains clear is that in the rigidly structured society of Antebellum, Georgia, the Preston sisters committed what was perhaps the most unforgivable transgression possible. Whether driven by genuine affection, psychological peculiarity, or some combination of factors, they not only crossed the most forbidden boundary of their era, but did so openly, challenging the fundamental social, racial, and gender hierarchies upon which their world was constructed. For this, they paid with their freedom, their home, and ultimately their lives. The final known reference to the Preston case appears in a personal letter written in 1958 by the last surviving direct descendant of Henry Preston. In it, she mentions donating the family Bible to a historical society and notes, "I've removed the page where someone, presumably Elizabeth, had written those 2 inappropriate entries." Some family stories are best laid to rest, especially when they reveal nothing but disturbance of mind and character. The past has weight enough without preserving its darkest chapters. That excised page has never been located. Like so many details of this story, it exists now only as an absence, a deliberate silence where evidence once stood. The true nature of what occurred at Willow Creek Plantation remains suspended between documented fragments and the vast, unrecorded reality of human experience, perhaps, as Elizabeth Preston might have intended, still waiting for an age capable of understanding it without judgment. Today, nothing remains of Willow Creek Plantation except foundation stones and a small family cemetery overgrown with Georgia pines. Local residents occasionally report hearing strange sounds on certain autumn evenings, what some describe as two female voices engaged in animated conversation, accompanied by male laughter. Historians and rationalists attribute these stories to the human tendency to embellish historical tragedies with supernatural elements. But for those who have stood on that lonely plot as twilight descends, there remains the unsettling sense of witnessing the echo of something that once defied its time. Four voices engaged in conversation as equals, still resonating across the centuries in a place where such a thing should have been impossible. In the county archives, a single daguerreotype survived the purge of Preston family materials. A formal portrait showing two plain-faced women in elaborate dress seated beside two strikingly handsome men standing behind them. No names are written on the back, no date is provided, and the catalogue lists it simply as unidentified Savannah residence, circa 1845. The archivist who rediscovered it in 1966 noted only that the composition was unusual for its era, as the two men were positioned in a manner typically reserved for family members rather than servants. But perhaps most telling is what the image captures that no written record could adequately convey. The unmistakable expression of contentment on four faces, each gazing directly into the camera as equals, united in a moment of shared dignity that their world was not yet prepared to witness or understand. In 1968, a graduate student researching the history of the Georgia State Asylum discovered an additional set of records that had been misfiled for decades. Among these papers was a detailed treatment log for Elizabeth Preston during her final months at the institution. The attending physician, Dr. Jonathan Miller, had maintained more comprehensive notes than was typical for the era, seemingly fascinated by what he termed a most unusual case of feminine moral degradation. His observations provide a chilling glimpse into Elizabeth's mental state as her health deteriorated following her sister's death. Patient EP continues to maintain the delusion regarding her inappropriate attachment, Miller wrote in August of 1850. Despite 39 months of treatment, including cold water therapy, isolation, and administration of laudanum and other sedatives, she exhibits no recognition of her moral failing. Most disturbing is her continued lucidity on all matters unrelated to her professed marriage. She can discuss literature, politics, and plantation management with surprising clarity and intelligence, only to lapse into her fantasy when conversation turns to personal matters. Miller's notes include transcriptions of conversations with Elizabeth, including one particularly striking exchange from September 12th, approximately 1 month before her death. When I inquired as to whether she now recognized the impropriety of her former behavior, patient replied, "What you call impropriety, doctor, future generations will recognize as courage." The world turns, moralities shift, and what seems monstrous in one age becomes merely ahead of its time in another. I have no regrets except that I could not protect those I loved from the consequences of my choices. This statement, remarkable for both its defiance and prescience, suggests that Elizabeth maintained her convictions until the end, even as her physical health failed. Miller interpreted this as proof of her incurable moral insanity, rather than as a testament to her resolve, noting that The patient's inability to recognize her degraded condition, even in the face of divine punishment through illness, demonstrates the profound depth of her depravity. Perhaps most revealing is Miller's documentation of Elizabeth's final days. According to his logs, she began refusing food in late September, accepting only water. When questioned about this decision, she reportedly stated, "I have seen all I wish to see of this world. Margaret awaits me in the next, and perhaps there we will find James and William as well, in a place where men's laws hold no sway over the heart's truth." Her deliberate starvation, rather than being recognized as a rational choice to end her suffering, was recorded as further evidence of mental instability. On the morning of October 7th, 1850, Miller documented his final interaction with Elizabeth Preston. Found patient extremely weakened but still conscious. When informed that her condition was grave and that spiritual counsel was available should she wish to repent before meeting her Maker, she smiled for the first time in my observation and whispered, "I have nothing to repent. I loved truly." Few can say as much. She died later that evening, with the official cause recorded as nervous decline following melancholia. Further insight into the Preston case emerged in 1969, when the descendant of a former Willow Creek enslaved person contacted the Georgia Historical Society with a family oral history passed down through generations. According to this account, the men known as James and William had not been born on the Preston plantation, but had been purchased specifically by the twins' father, Thomas Preston, when they were approximately 16 years old. Unlike most enslaved persons acquired for plantation labor, these young men had been selected for their intelligence and appearance, with Thomas Preston allegedly stating his intention to train them for house service. The oral history suggested that the elder Preston had indeed secretly educated both young men, teaching them to read, write, and manage accounts, skills that would have been illegal for enslaved individuals to possess under Georgia law at the time. Following Thomas Preston's death, the twins had apparently continued and expanded this education, gradually elevating the two men to positions of significant responsibility within the household and plantation management. Most intriguingly, this family account claimed that the relationships between the twins and these men had developed gradually over the 7 years following their parents' death, evolving from a master-servant dynamic to something more complex and mutual. The decision to publicly acknowledge these relationships as marriages was reportedly made collectively by all four individuals after years of maintaining appearances, a deliberate political act rather than merely a social scandal. While impossible to verify independently, this narrative provides a potential explanation for the careful planning evident in the Preston sisters' actions. Rather than a sudden descent into moral insanity, their behavior appears more consistent with a calculated risk taken by individuals who had created an alternative social arrangement in private and chose to challenge public norms despite understanding the likely consequences. This interpretation gained additional support in 1972, when an archaeological excavation of the Willow Creek site uncovered the foundation of a small structure approximately 100 yards from the main house foundations. This building, not documented in any surviving plantation records, contained artifacts suggesting it had been a private living quarter of unusual quality. Among the items recovered were fragments of imported porcelain, quality writing implements, and most surprisingly, a concealed compartment beneath the floorboards containing a small collection of books on philosophy, mathematics, and political theory. Readings that would have been extraordinary for anyone other than educated white men in that era. The archaeologist overseeing the excavation, Dr. Richard Thompson, noted in his report that the structure appeared to have been deliberately designed to provide both privacy and dignity, with appointments more suited to a gentleman's quarters than to typical slave cabins of the period. He speculated that this building might have served as a private retreat where the sisters and their chosen companions could interact away from the observation of other enslaved persons and occasional visitors, maintaining an outer facade of conventional plantation hierarchy while creating a separate, hidden reality. Further evidence emerged in 1974, when a collection of business records from a New Orleans slave trader was donated to Tulane University. Among these documents was a sales record dated May 18, 1847, listing the purchase of 2 prime specimens, age approximately 30 years each, unusually educated, previously held in Georgia. The record indicated that these individuals had been sold to a coffee plantation owner from Brazil, who specifically sought enslaved persons with management experience for his expanding operation. While the names in this record do not match those attributed to the Preston twins' companions, the timing, origin, and unusual description of these men as educated strongly suggests they may indeed have been the same individuals. If so, this document provides the only indication of their fate following removal from Willow Creek. The Brazilian destination is particularly notable, as slavery would continue in Brazil until 1888, long after its abolition in the United States, effectively ensuring these men would never return to Georgia or have any opportunity to share their version of events. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence supporting the authenticity of the Preston story came from an unexpected source. In 1978, a researcher at the University of Georgia discovered a series of cryptic entries in the margin of a plantation ledger from a neighboring property. These notes, written in a nearly microscopic hand, appeared to document observations of the Preston estate during the critical period of 1846 to 47. The author, presumably an overseer or manager at the neighboring plantation, recorded seeing the twin mistresses walking the grounds accompanied by their favored men, all 4 engaged in conversation as though equals, and lights burning until dawn in the separate quarter where unnatural arrangements are conducted. Most significantly, this observer noted that following the removal of the Preston sisters in April of 1847, there had been a brief but intense search of the plantation grounds led by the newly appointed manager, Henry Preston. According to the margin notes, this search focused particularly on locating papers and evidence of improper activities. The writer recorded hearing from an enslaved person who had witnessed the burning of many documents and personal items in the orchard, including what appeared to be letters, journals, and several small portraits. This account suggests a deliberate effort to purge evidence of the true nature of the relationships at Willow Creek, perhaps explaining why so few direct records from the principals themselves have survived. The attempt to erase this history extended beyond mere social embarrassment, representing instead a systematic removal of anything that might humanize the participants or lend credibility to their choices. The Preston case gained renewed attention in 1982, when feminist historian Dr. Catherine Marshall published Against the Grain, Women Who Defied Antebellum Social Codes. Her chapter on the Preston twins reframed their story not as one of mental illness or moral failing, but as an early, if ultimately unsuccessful, challenge to the intersecting oppressions of gender and race that defined Southern society. Marshall argued that the sisters' actions represented a deliberate repudiation of the foundational myths of white Southern womanhood, particularly the notion that white women needed protection from black men, a concept that underpinned both slavery and patriarchal control of white women's sexuality. by publicly claiming these men as husbands rather than exploiting them as many plantation mistresses did in secret. Marshall wrote, the Preston twins struck at the core contradiction of the Southern social system, that black men could be simultaneously dehumanized as property and feared as threats to white women's virtue. Their actions exposed the hypocrisy of a society that tacitly permitted sexual exploitation while violently punishing consensual relationships that challenged racial hierarchy. Marshall's analysis drew criticism from traditional historians who considered it anachronistic to attribute modern political consciousness to 19th century figures. However, Elizabeth Preston's own words in her recovered letter, a testament that might survive even if we do not, proof that even in this darkest of times and places, genuine affection can transcend the artificial boundaries erected by men, suggest a level of intentionality and awareness that lends credence to Marshall's interpretation. In 1993, a further dimension of the story emerged when descendants of the Johnson family, whose ancestor had provided the Federal Writers' Project testimony, came forward with additional oral history about the fate of James and William. According to this family account, passed down through generations, the men had not been immediately transported out of Georgia after being removed from Willow Creek. Instead, they had been temporarily held at a trader's compound outside Savannah, while arrangements for their sale were finalized. During this period, according to the Johnson family narrative, a small group of free black dockworkers in Savannah had learned of their situation and attempted to make contact. These men, part of a clandestine network that occasionally assisted enslaved persons seeking freedom, reportedly managed to convey a message offering help with escape. The response, as preserved in this oral tradition, was both poignant and revealing. We thank you for your courage, but our beloveds are beyond your help or ours. If we cannot live openly as we choose, we will not live secretly in fear. Remember us as men who were briefly husbands and masters of our fate, not as fugitives. If accurate, this account suggests that James and William, like the Preston sisters, had embraced their public stance with full awareness of the likely consequences, choosing a kind of martyrdom to principle rather than attempting to salvage their individual freedom at the cost of abandoning their larger challenge to the system. While impossible to verify independently, this narrative aligns with the remarkable composure and conviction Elizabeth Preston maintained throughout her confinement and until her death. The most recent contribution to the historical record came in 2003, when a previously unknown diary was discovered during renovation of an old house in Milledgeville, Georgia. This journal, kept by a junior attendant at the Georgia State Asylum from 1848 to 1851, contains several entries regarding the Preston sisters. Most notably, the attendant recorded that Margaret Preston, in the weeks before her death, had managed to create a small pencil drawing which she kept hidden beneath her mattress. The patient in room 17 passed this morning, reads the entry from January 23, 1850. Upon stripping her bedding, I discovered a crude drawing concealed in the seam of the mattress. It depicted 4 figures standing together before what appeared to be a large house. Though the artistry was poor, the care taken in the details of their faces was remarkable. Most unusual was that all 4 figures were holding hands. I showed it to Dr. Miller, who identified the deceased and her sister among the figures and ordered the drawing burned immediately as evidence of her persistent delusions. I carried out this task as instructed, but confessed to finding something more sad than shameful in this last comfort the poor woman had created for herself. This small act of creation, a final attempt to preserve the memory of a brief period of happiness and equality in a society built to deny both, provides perhaps the most human glimpse into the interior lives of those involved in this extraordinary case. Like the missing page from the family Bible, and the burned correspondence, Margaret's drawing exists now only as an absence, known to history only because someone thought to record its destruction. Today, the Preston case remains largely forgotten outside academic circles, a historical footnote overshadowed by larger narratives of the antebellum South and Civil War that followed. The site of Willow Creek Plantation lies unmarked, the foundations gradually reclaimed by Georgia pine and kudzu. The graves of Elizabeth and Margaret Preston in the family plot bear only their names and birth years, with no indication of the remarkable choice they made or the price they paid for it. Yet in archives, oral histories, archaeological fragments and marginalia, traces remain of 4 individuals who, for a brief moment in 1846, created a private world of equality and mutual recognition within the most unequal society in American history. Their attempt to bring that private reality into public view, to live honestly in a time and place built on strategic denial and enforced silence, was perhaps doomed from the start. But their story, preserved in fragments across 2 centuries, raises profound questions about the nature of love, resistance, and human dignity in the face of overwhelming social constraint. "Some things are too terrible to keep in mind," Sarah Johnson had said when asked about the fate of the men from Willow Creek. Perhaps she referred not just to their physical fate, but to the larger tragedy their story represents, the crushing of a brief, fragile experiment in human recognition and equality under the weight of a society that could not allow such a challenge to exist. In October of 1969, a small ceremony was held at the overgrown site of Willow Creek Plantation. Organized by students from the University of Georgia's History Department, the gathering included academics, local residents, and several descendants of people once enslaved in the area. They placed a simple unmarked stone at what archaeological evidence suggested had been the entrance to the small, separate quarter where James and William had likely resided. No speeches were recorded, no plaque was installed, but participants later described standing in silence as the autumn sun set over the pine forest that had reclaimed the once productive fields of cotton and indigo. One attendee, an elderly woman descended from the neighboring Johnson plantation, was heard to remark quietly, "They knew what they were doing, all 4 of them. They wanted to show what was possible, even knowing it wasn't time yet." Sometimes that's all you can do, plant a seed and hope someone remembers to water it long after you're gone. The Preston story remains not just a historical curiosity, but a profound meditation on the human capacity for both cruelty and courage in the face of entrenched systems of power. It raises uncomfortable questions about how societies enforce conformity, pathologize resistance, and attempt to erase challenges to their foundational myths. Most poignantly, perhaps, it reminds us that behind the broad brushstrokes of historical narrative lie countless individual lives, some conforming to their times, others blazing briefly against the darkness of convention before being extinguished. As Elizabeth Preston wrote in her final preserved letter, "Southern society will destroy what it cannot understand, and it understands precious little beyond its own narrow codes and hypocrisies." But I write this so that someone someday might know that in the spring of 1846, 4 people dared to live honestly on a plantation west of Savannah, creating a small world of equality within a larger one built on its opposite. That world lasted only 9 months before being crushed by the full weight of social, legal, and medical authority. But its memory, preserved in fragments across archives and generations, endures as a testament to the possibility of human connection across the most formidable barriers of caste and circumstance, and to the terrible price sometimes paid by those who dare to challenge a society not yet ready to change. In the Georgia Historical Society today, the single surviving daguerreotype still sits in its acid-free folder, catalogued simply as Unidentified Savannah Residence, circa 1845. The four faces gaze out across nearly 2 centuries with an expression that might be read as defiance, or perhaps merely as the quiet dignity of people who, for one brief moment, chose to live according to their own truth rather than the comfortable lies of their time. Their names, their stories, and even the exact nature of their relationships remain subjects of scholarly debate and speculation. But in that image, preserved by chance or oversight when so much else was deliberately destroyed, they continue to bear witness to a possibility once glimpsed and then violently suppressed. 4 people standing together as equals in a time and place where such equality was not merely unusual but revolutionary. As the sun sets over the Georgia pines that now cover the former grounds of Willow Creek Plantation, one might imagine 4 figures walking together in the evening cool. 2 women society deemed too unattractive for marriage. 2 men society refused to recognize as fully human. All 4 creating between them a small, fragile space where different rules applied. That space could not last in the Georgia of 1846. But its memory, preserved against significant odds, serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times and places, the human capacity for recognition, dignity, and love can occasionally transcend the artificial boundaries erected to contain it. "I have nothing to repent," Elizabeth Preston whispered in her final hours. "I loved truly. Few can say as much."